Does that work? Yeah, sorry. So thank you both for really rich papers, and we've got plenty of time now before lunch for some questions. So who wants to go first?
Thank you both for your papers. They were terrific. My question is probably... Jonathan, your description of your way of coming to understand the barrack shields, pairing shields, was largely through one of spending time, the Yinjamara idea, of spending some time of drawing it, of just getting to know it in a way that's both fixated on the object but also subjective, getting to know the object. And it reminded me of what is often said of Karel Kupka when he first came out here, that he too drew works in Elkin's offices or rooms nearby before going up to talk to the artists and work with those artists and trying to understand the meanings of these images. It's a kind of way of knowing that's visual, sure, but it's corporeal too. It uses the body. It's sort of kinesthetic form of knowledge. It opens up the discourse beyond the object to a more immaterial kind of intangible, heritage. So one of the questions that was presenting itself to me in all that was, to what extent do you think somebody like Karel Kupka, or some of us in the room, and I'll put my hand up here, are able to go through that process of the Yinjamara when we are not Indigenous people? Is that a valid way of thinking? Is it a real possibility for us, as it seems to have been, according to the discourses, for somebody like Karel Kupka? Thank you.
Yeah, look, yeah, so my elders would always say that, yes, if you're on Wiradjuri country, you need to abide by Wiradjuri ways of doing things. And so it doesn't matter who you are. And I think you heard Uncle Ray Davidson this morning too tell us very clearly that, if you're from Sydney or born here or live here, you have responsibilities to here. So I do think that those Aboriginal ways of learning are really important for everyone as a way of moving, as kind of creating new knowledge. And I think that's one of the issues. That's the failure of museums. I think at the moment is they're completely embedded in Western knowledge systems that have taken them only so far. Most people would tell you that Southeast's collections are dead. There's nothing to do with, you can't gain any more knowledge from them. They were collected way back when, and the contextual information around how they were collected and why they were collected and what they were, all that happened back then. And so there's not really a lot of, you can't actually do a lot with them. This was just one example of many, many examples that we've been able to attribute objects to makers, and so, by bringing in these new knowledge systems and these new ways of doing things, I think we'll generate new knowledge. And I guess that's obviously what, acknowledging a wider knowledge base is all about for everyone. And that can only improve everyone, I think.
Only because everyone else was quiet. First of all, Jonathan, congratulations on completing your PhD, Dr. Jones. I had the pleasure of reading it, and it was a knockout And like all good PhDs, you'll be drawing on that for some time to come, and your work here is continuing that process. Something I was interested to hear more of when you were talking is how you figure in your work. How does your research into these objects, predominantly men's objects, and investigating the personal identity and association of these objects, how does that work in terms of your own practice as an artist and your own kind of way of being in the world as an Aboriginal person? Just a small question.
That's the small one. It's evolving, I think, and I think that was something I wanted to make really clear at the beginning, that when you do your research, it sort of gets presented like some final finished thing, that it was sort of perfectly born child. When it was a very long process. In fact, it was really interesting. It was only sitting with Uncle Stan that I said to him, I don't know why. It's really difficult for me. I go into collections. I don't know what's there. I ask to see Southeast material. I research it. I end up finding someone's family member. I then have to backtrack and go find that family and say, sorry, can I research your family? I already have, to find you. I'm really sorry, this is sort of broken protocol, but this is what I'm trying to do. And I remember saying to Uncle Stan, I don't know why I don't want to work like this. I don't know why no one's really listened to these shields before. Surely someone could have done this before. And it was him. He was the one that said, well, this is Hinjamara. This is you sitting down, and, those shields are going to tell you something because you've actually spent some time with them. You've bothered to listen to them. And so I think, it's interesting. So it's complicated going back into community. On a very sort of, practical level of protocol, and saying, I found your family, and I found this object, and can I research it? And it's been met with some really interesting responses. Which I don't know. For me, it's sort of really interesting in that way, that you get into a community and try and work in a respectful way. And more than anything, it's opened up possibilities. It's opened up my heart to possibilities, because I'm not in any way, and this is something I'm struggling with at the moment as I get as I move on, is this idea of what's this spirituality? Is this shield really talking to me? A lot of Aboriginal elders are very kind of spiritual, and it's something that I'm struggling with at the moment. I think that's probably something that these issues and these research is emerging for me, that I'm really trying to work through, because I'm not sure what it all means. I'm not sure why these objects, arrive on my desk, or why I see something that someone else hasn't seen when these shields, some of these shields, like the Victorian Museum, some of those shields have been up for years. They've been up since the museum opened, and no one's looked at them and kind of gone, oh, there's another shield that looks like that shield, there's another shield that looks like that shield. When we put these three shields together, they actually tell us where it comes from, and a bigger story. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. It's still emerging. Ask me again in a couple of years.
So Alison, Jonathan's sort of spoken about this question of spirituality, and it sounds like some of your work is grappling with that in terms of a relationship around belief. And I guess what struck me is that there were parallels in terms of the colonial, the 19th century examples, in which there didn't seem to be huge amounts of exchange. Jonathan's example that the shields basically come sort of undocumented. We don't know what the lines mean, but then a kind of different shift in the 20th century, where you're sort of arguing, I think, of much more sort of exchange, but also still in a sense quite parallel.
Yes, I think that Jonathan's issue of the degree to which the objects can speak and the degree to which we need a context and we need secondary or alternative forms of primary evidence. I actually left out a really important quote, and I'm going to come back to it now. I'm pleased to do this, which was to do with trying to make sense of those so-called tribal symbols on the floor of the church. And the interesting thing was, I've been looking at some of the missionary publications which have first-hand accounts by the Aboriginal community. But, you know, that's one form of, it's framed by certain things. But having, you had Mary Durack saying they're tribal symbols, and we had the Nyundul elder Rosie Victor, in recalling her life, talking about how she put the shells into the ground, that they were things like local bush tucker and animals. But she also stated in this account, they were symbols of the whole bush before the Blessed Sacrament in adoration. So you've got to be careful about dividing up your European and your Aboriginal communities into sort of separate. There's overlap of belief systems. But then she adds, there were also symbols of weapons. And I had a look as much as I can because I'm looking at photographs. And yes, there were boomerangs and other things, or whether they were curved weaponry. And I thought that's an interesting thing to have on the floor. So there's sometimes just a small sentence sort of opens up a lot of possibilities. But it's, I don't know what to think at this point. It's just complicated.
I guess there's that really, I was just going to say too, there's that really interesting thing which I think Aboriginal people are really, really good at seeing one object and seeing it in a number of different ways. It's this sort of very Western way of narrowing something down, which, and that it is an absolute and it has to be this one story with one genesis and one outcome, which it's always, I mean, I'm always marvelled at elders when they, they can accept stories and see different stories and just slot them into a bigger worldview. It's a worldview that accepts things and builds bigger narratives and builds on stories, which, again, is another thing I think we could all learn something from. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to compliment you on some excellent presentations that have been very thought-provoking. My question's related to the relationship of the First Nations people with the materials that they were using, and I'll divide that up into two categories. Jonathan, in relation to the shields, what importance was attached to the wood that was used, for example? Were the two shields that you've identified as being authored by Barak of the same kind of wood? And in the process of selection, were these woods chosen mainly for their physical properties, or were there also intangible or metaphysical properties? And did the selection of woods vary as between particular nations? Did they vary geographically? And how did that reflect belief systems or cultural practices in terms of that selection? And I had a similar question in relation to the use of shells, particularly up in the Kimberley, as to what evidence there was of the relationship with use of shells prior to the European occupation. And secondly, in terms of, and this was partially answered by what you'd said earlier, but secondly, what was the relationship with the availability of shells on I assume, an industrial scale that didn't previously exist? Did this create the shells as a medium that was a little bit like the introduction of acrylic paint to the Western Desert peoples in the 1970s? Did it create a new perception of a material that could then be used for an expression of traditional cultural practice. Thank you.
I'll go first. I don't think it was the Western pearling industry that increased access of the local community to pearl shell, because it is so, it is such a strength in those waters that the Aboriginal communities had access to that as a material. And in his book, which I recommend, Kim Ackerman's book on the Kimberley pearl shell trade routes, really, the pearl shells as implements of power that are particularly associated with water and rain are traded right into the central parts of Australia. So they have, these things have been traced through objects. They have a well-established use as objects of power in the communities. We have photographs of traditional communities in which the men are wearing items of pearl shell, and you have a fairly close transfer of knowledge down through the relatively few generations for contemporary engravers of shell who are using the symbols and totems of their clans. So I think that in some way what you get alongside that strong tradition is Western pearl usage, and you have Western artists engraving pearl shells, and there's a whole tourist and trade in that, but there's also sort of the industrial, the shell going off to be turned into objects. So I think that there's two, and I think that's going back to Jonathan's point. It's interesting when the things are the same at the same time but different. And in the case of the use of pearl shell, it had both very long-standing traditions in both cultures that had similarities but could be different and similar at the same time. And that's why I think the material's so interesting. It invites multiple layered interpretations which can all be sort of right at the same time, but they're different.
Yes, that's a very big, complicated question. But the shields, the barrack shields haven't been tested, so the wood hasn't been taken and sampled. But it's difficult to say what. It's difficult to say with Barrack how much he was able to engage in traditional practices. I mean, we're talking about someone who'd been, effectively confined to a mission. So we're not sure, if he was able, and we know that he was compromising his culture constantly. We know that he was finding and navigating and retracking new ways to keep moving forward. So we're not entirely sure that if those shields, were able to be made according to a much older context. When we look at them, people talk about them as being made with steel tools, and I think that's because people see very deliberate, nice, really clean, sharp edges. But I mean, I'm also not totally down with that either. I think when we look at the way some traditional tools work, they're better, or create a similar, they create a similar kind of cut. So those shields are very difficult to know. In a bigger picture, we would, for sure, most kind of people talk about, particular woods being used in particular ways, materials being traded, and so those significant things that we know that there's also woods that some people, refuse to burn. We know that there's some objects that were made in some regions and literally the mob next door didn't make that object. So we know that those objects obviously having enormous significance to the point where, you know, they had access to the same resources, they had access to the same technology. They've obviously been watching this other mob make them for X amount of years, and, you know, and they choose for a reason, you know, through their knowledge systems not to make that object. So we know that they must be sitting in a very kind of structured order, but because of the way that we've lived, the way that we've experienced life in this part of the country, that knowledge is not with us, sadly. But we are really blessed. We have extraordinary people, you know, like in La Perouse, you know, Uncle Greg Sims, you know, that mob always used for boomerangs, for instance, you know, the mangrove wood. And the reason mangrove wood is because it bounces. It's got some bend in it. So when it hits the ground, it just keeps, you know, it doesn't shatter. It's a really good material. So we know that people were, you know, really looking for certain timbers for certain reasons. So it's a difficult answer. But I guess there's all these fragments of knowledge that we can kind of pull together to say that, yeah, that obviously people would have been engaging in a highly selective practice and process for certain and very specific reasons.
We might have time for one more question if there is one. No, okay. I guess I just wanted to make one final comment. The thing that struck me, I suppose, is that there's a kind of a whole history of relationship to place or placemaking. And in your situation, Alison, it's striking that it's being used in a form that is sort of permanent or structural or, you know, creating things in buildings, or and here much more the sort of mobility of the objects, which is also a kind of issue around the knowledge that goes with them. But your process, in some ways, Jonathan, is suggesting a kind of way of new forms of archiving or relating to work as well. So it's just a sort of, I do think you've given us the challenge of understanding these parallel practices, but getting to the heart of what the nature of that is. I think we can kind of draw some parallels in which there's a kind of a really strong settler effort to make place permanent and very visible, and a difficult one really around a kind of a sense of institutionalisation and homelessness that makes these objects, I think, incredibly significant now as well. So that's us, and now it is lunchtime.